Greetings, music nerds, and welcome to Season 8 of the Music Makers and Soul Shakers podcast. This season is brought to you by our newest sponsors, Larrivee Guitars and Fishman Amplification. I'm your host, Steve Dawson, coming to you from the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. This season, I'll be taking you on a journey down the many rabbit holes in the process of making great music. I'll be speaking to instrumentalists, songwriters, producers, up-and-comers through legendary veterans, and we'll go deep into their history and their process of creating unforgettable music. This show continues to be listener-supported. You can help keep the show going with a one-time donation or a Patreon subscription. And when you sign up for Patreon, you get an ad-free version of the show, as well as getting entered to win some killer prizes from our sponsors at the end of the season. We have an incredible Chase Bliss Lossy pedal up for grabs, as well as a Fishman acoustic guitar pickup and effects pedals, as well as a pedal from Union Tube and Transistor, and more. You can get links to all this and sign up now at makersandshakerspodcast.com. Meanwhile, many thanks to the sponsors for this season. Please check them out and let them know that I sent you. They are Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Hen House Hang. All right, thanks for tuning in, and let's get down to it. Howdy, music nerds, and welcome to episode 162 of the podcast. Singer, songwriter, and guitarist Margaret Glaspy joins me on the show this week. I hope the summer's treating you all pretty well so far. I'm mostly in the studio these days, but I do have a few shows coming up. I'll be making an appearance with my Hawaiian band, the Volcano Brothers, here in Nashville. We only play in Nashville. It's me and Dave Jakes on bass and Richard Bennett on guitar. Awesome band. And we play 1920s Hawaiian music only, and only in Nashville. So we'll be at the Basement on July 1st. That's at 7 p.m. sharp. And then I'll also be working a lot at the Vancouver Folk Festival, playing a bunch of shows around that festival, July 20th and 21st. Hope to see some of you out there. Please come and say hello. So on the show this week is Margaret Glaspy. And when her last full-length LP came out, which was just last year, I could not stop playing it. It's called Echo the Diamond, and it's an incredible listen. Margaret started out as a fiddle player and played pretty seriously around California as a youngster before dedicating herself more to the guitar and to songwriting. And eventually she wound up going to Berklee College of Music for a short time to study music there. She played around Boston and then moved to New York, where she found her way into the creative music scene in Brooklyn in the mid-2000s. And she started making EPs and then eventually full-length albums in around 2016. And I first heard her Emotions and Math LP and was really intrigued by her approach to writing, and especially how she seemed to build these really cool, unique, intricate, angular guitar parts that would weave through her songs. Her next album, Devotion, came out in 2020, and then Echo the Diamond, which was one of my favorite records of last year. The guitar playing on that is intense and jagged, and the band is incredible. She sings amazing. The songwriting is top-notch. The band is Chris Morrissey, who's played with Andrew Bird and Ben Kweller, and David King, the drummer for the Bad Plus. So it's a hell of a band. And it's a co-production also with her husband, Julian Lage. And Margaret has also produced several of Julian's recent releases. She just released a solo acoustic record called The Sun Doesn't Think, and we talk about all of these projects here today on the show. So check out all of Margaret's amazing music and find out where she's playing over at margaretglaspy.com. And with that, please enjoy my conversation with Margaret Glaspy. Are you doing a bunch of touring these days, or are you mostly at home, or what's your latest situation?
I just made, I'm home right now. I just made an EP that comes out on April 26th. And so I've just been in the throes of that. And then May 2nd, I start tour.
Okay. So
that could be something to, mention. It's an East Coast tour that's all unplugged and acoustic.
Okay.
So that's the look. But yeah, so I'll go on tour then. And then starting in the summer, there's some festivals and go to Japan and do some gigs there, which will be cool. And then in the fall, I'm going to start working on a new record, like full-length record. So that'll be that.
That opens up a couple cans of worms. Tell me about your tour. Like, when is that East Coast tour? Is that in May, June kind of thing?
It's at the top of May. So May 2nd.
Okay. It starts then.
Yeah, it starts on May 2nd, I think, through the 10th. I can send you dates and everything.
Yeah, because this, like, my season doesn't start until the second week of May, so I could.
Oh, got it. Okay.
I might be able to. Like, does that defeat the purpose?
No. I mean, I think it'll defeat the purpose in terms of that tour for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The EP thing has been something that you've done a lot of. You've started with some EPs. You have consistently put out EPs in between records. Tell me about that. Like, as an artist, as a songwriter, what makes the EP format appealing to you?
I think it's for me, it's often like a transitional kind of device in a way.
Yeah.
And kind of like a creative way to keep the ball in the air for myself. It's nice to be able to, after you've put like everything into a record and then you tour, for a long time, and then you come home, you're tired, but you haven't totally landed,
Yeah.
And there's often still kind of music left over in my brain. And also I think it's always been a healthy kind of way for me to be able to come off of tour, knowing that I can still, I'm going to start working on this now and keep creative in that time. So I like making smaller bodies of work in that way because they often happen really quickly for me. And this is probably, my EP will have been out for a couple of weeks by the time people hear this probably, but this is the quickest I've ever, between writing it and releasing it, I've ever had. So it's kind of a fun process because it's still very fresh for me. And usually you make a record 6 to 8 months later, it's there. Yeah. But it was like, about a month from making it to it releasing. So that's kind of unusual for even me.
That's a cool thing these days that you can pull off. Like I remember reading Brian Wilson's autobiography, and he talked about going into the studio and doing a Beach Boys single. This is like in the heyday of the Beach Boys, like 64 or 65, and submitting the mix to the label, and that afternoon hearing the song on the radio in his car.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So do you write music when you're on tour?
It depends on the tour, and it kind of depends on the tour. Often I have music that I've been working on, and then by the time I go on tour, I start to work it out while I'm on tour. So I start to play the music at sound checks. I'll start to play new music in the set.
Oh yeah.
It kind of starts to feel like things are being worked out. Arrangements are starting to land.
Yeah.
And then it also feels like this little, like beta testing or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're able to show people things that they've never heard and really get an earnest reaction without it just kind of being in their muscle memory because they've heard it somewhere before. So
right.
I think that is a really fascinating. I kind of wish that I could do that all day.
just that, like
just play music no one's ever heard before.
drop all that stuff that you know how to play really well and just
yeah, totally. And also just that no one knows. It's a really cool interaction to play things that no one knows because you get a really honest reading. Like I might do it one night and then everyone's just like totally checked out and is not into it. And I'll try a different song, and everyone's really locked in and really attentive. So you kind of get a real, a very in the moment read on what's compelling or not about something.
That's also interesting too, because I know a lot of people that refuse to play new stuff on tour because they're afraid it'll show up on YouTube in some pre-finished format before the record is out and they don't want it to get ruined.
Yeah.
You're not like that.
I'm not like that,
no. Like, would you perform a song that you feel may not be finished?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, wow. Cool.
I mean, okay. I know that it's finished probably lyrically, but I'm not quite sure in terms of the arrangement where it's at. I mean, I think for me, it's really like process is like the point in many ways. I enjoy that process, so I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like, it is what it is. I like doing that. And I like the feeling of playing things that I don't necessarily know yet.
Yeah.
and seeing like what can happen. And that like kind of tightrope walk feels really exciting to me. And kind of like the point of live music at times, feels that's what I get out of it. I think is that little tightrope feeling of feeling like, because there isn't like a backup plan necessarily. And also because I've spent my life playing music, I like it. It feels cool to like go into, another gear, to either have to save something or pat yourself on the back because it actually went well, or go like, wow, that was a disaster.
Yeah.
All kind of like interesting and exciting to me on some level.
Yeah, I get that. So where do you actually find the time? I'm curious because I've spent a lot of time on the road, and I'm not a consistent songwriter at the best of times, but I am a songwriter. I usually have to carve out time for myself, but for me, like, there is no way I could write music on the road. Maybe instrumental stuff or something, which I have done, I guess, but I couldn't do it. So I'm just curious, like, do you do it in the van, in the bus? Do you write songs on a plane? Do you just do it during sound checks, hotels? Like, what's your favorite way to pull that off?
Sound check to me is really interesting, fertile ground for trying like arrangements and trying to make something happen in like just a live feeling way. So that's not necessarily writing. Sometimes there can be flares of writing where it's like, I'm going to try and write a riff right now to the song. So that's like more instrumental forward in terms of like the writing part of it. But then I think that if I'm on a bus tour, it's certainly a lot easier to write because I have the day to myself.
Right.
And I've also found, depending on the situation, if I was, in the past, if I was opening for a band and I had these little pockets of time where everyone else is needed, and you have your alone time. And that was certainly where I would write a lot of music. I wrote a lot of the music for Echo the Diamond in that way. Just these private times where I could. And I think sometimes on tour, I think everyone kind of describes it differently, but tour is like it's a real wild and woolly place, in many ways. And then
it
also
certainly is.
It's like really dependable. You kind of do the same thing every day.
Yeah.
But again, it's kind of like a tightrope walk. Everyone's, in a random place, kind of erecting and then taking down this show every night. And it's bizarre. It's a weird rhythm, and yet it's also you can count on it every day. So I think that for me, sometimes writing on that kind of tour felt like what keeps me alive. Like it felt like what really drives me forward and feels like, oh, this is mine. This is my territory. And so I can use it as kind of like my bubble that I get to be in and kind of create boundaries with it in a way. So I've always liked that because it always felt healthy, like a healthy device.
Yeah, I understand. What about the way that you write, like with instruments? I would definitely peg you as probably a guitar forward songwriter. But then when I listen to Devotion, I'm not sure anymore. I don't know if tunes like that were written on guitar and just arranged and recorded differently. But it certainly seems like with Echo the Diamond, which we'll talk about soon. But before we get there, just writing wise, where your music comes across as guitar centric, do you always write with the guitar or do you write with other instruments?
For Devotion, I wrote with other instruments. I was really, I got into synthesis and Max MSP and all these different kinds of modalities of writing and making sound happen. But for the most part, guitar. Yeah, I usually write acoustic guitar and then I cover all my own songs on electric. That's like how I make records for the most part.
That's interesting because a lot of what I hear on Echo is like pretty revolving around like some crazy sounding electric guitar parts, like not at all like a nice acoustic guitar strummed thing. It's like kind of angular riffage that's happening,
Right.
which I love, but it seems unusual that you would. So your first inclination is to write on an acoustic. Are you playing like more kind of normally voiced chords and stuff as you're writing, or are you kind of coming up with the riffs on the acoustic as well?
Right. I think I have a little bit of I wouldn't say a method, but for lack of a better word, I kind of have a thing that I do every time I write. I write pretty often and I write pretty quickly, mainly so that I will do it more often. That's kind of where I've settled with it. And it's worked. It feels like I show up to it more often because I know that it's only going to last 15 minutes. That's kind of, for me, the amount of time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But in that 15 minutes, I'm writing the entire time. And it's really me showing up to the guitar with the intent of improvising a song in real time. So it's very improvised. I think sometimes it's interesting with songwriting because I don't think it's thought of as improvisation. It's thought of as composition. But for me, I think it's really deeply rooted in improvisation. And of course, there's then the kind of compositional mind comes in after I'm done with that 15 minutes. But I'm making things happen for 15 minutes straight without really second guessing much. And then afterward, going back in to see like, okay, what happened?
So will you tend to record that 15-minute chunk of time?
Whole thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Every single time.
Okay.
And then after that, I listen to that 15 minutes. I start to lift things out of there that feel worthy or that I enjoy and think are cool.
Like right away you go back, or is this like 2 weeks later you come back to it?
Sometimes I'll do it right away, but I will always do 15 minutes. It's kind of like what I like. I probably do that like 4 or 5 times a week,
Okay. Yeah.
And then sometimes some of those sessions I'll do another 15 minutes. Yeah. And that 15 minutes is not necessarily this kind of improvised, intense kind of presence work, but it's more like editing and puzzling and figuring out. And maybe now that I know the song's in B flat and it's, got this kind of verse happening, I need more lyrics for those verses. So I'm going to write a bunch of verses. And then now I have all the verses written. And then, let's think about, I already kind of have a chorus, but it doesn't make sense. So let's understand what I'm actually doing, on like a human kind of narrative writing level. So it's like I can count on, I'll always do 15 minutes, and whether I have time or whether I want to, and I'm invested in kind of going back in for that next chunk, just kind of depends. But then all of a sudden, if you do that often, by the end of the month, you've like written a record,
That is fascinating to me.
Your archive starts to really become dense. And it's kind of interesting and cool because then you go into your voice memos and you have all of these recordings of things you've never really necessarily heard if you haven't gone back into them. And so, by the end of the month, I don't do it religiously, but I kind of just end up doing it, is that I go back and I start to find the things that are worth time and need to be addressed. And then I start to favorite all those things. And then with kind of favorites, quote favorites, folder or whatever.
Yeah.
All on the very sophisticated voice memos app.
Well, you have to be organized, right? Because that would be ultimately like, that would be too much to efficiently like be able to deal with in a way if you didn't have some sort of way to file it. So you were like, this is going to be worth listening to.
Yeah, kind of. I think once I have things that start to kind of aggregate, I kind of know like, oh, this is adding up to be a lot of stuff. So I'm going to go through it and see what the deal is so that I'm not like backlogged for, 6 months, whatever, like 20, 30 recordings a month. And, it's a lot of stuff, especially 15 minutes because it's kind of a long time. I mean, it doesn't sound long, but when you're listening to a 15-minute recording, it can start to add up. Like I don't have time to listen to that many all day long, but things like naturally kind of sift to the top. And then the things that didn't sift to the top, you then find later and go, oh my God, I forgot about this. And this is great, you know? So it's cool. I've gained a lot from kind of settling into that process a little bit. And then once I'm touching the electric guitar, it usually means I'm going to make a record. Usually there's, you know, whatever. I make records in all different ways, but I like to cover my songs on electric guitar. And that's when riffs and stuff start to happen. It's probably not all the things that you hear on even a record like Echo the Diamond. I didn't write everything on the acoustic. The chords, the lyrics, things like that, the bed of it kind of was born on the acoustic. And then by the time I've touched the electric, I start to change things a little bit still. Not everything is so dialed in. So when I cover it, I mean, I'm like interpreting, you know, they change and sometimes the chords change. Things become a little more forward, I would say.
Yeah. And there's implied chords in what you're doing rather than you're not spelling it out like a normal guitar player.
Consider me abnormal. Thank you. I'll take this compliment.
Yeah, I think you should. Okay, so the 15-minute thing is fascinating to me. I've never heard of this, and I like the idea of it, actually. So is it totally stream of consciousness, or are you like sort of riffing around on an idea that you've totally got, or are you just like putting the voice memo on and just like starting from scratch?
I prefer to not have an idea going into those because, again, if it's idea based or if I have to have an idea, I probably won't do it, you know, because I don't always have an idea. But I think that probably like a big, you know, nobody taught me to do this. I just kind of started to land on it because I was writing songs a lot, and this kind of started to become a way to do it. But I think one of the big things I've learned from doing it is that it's in the air, you know, like songs are just, they're around us, and art is, and these kinds of notions and ideas, all this humanity that we're kind of tapping into on some level. It's like, you don't really do a whole lot. If you let it come in, then it starts to kind of move through you in a certain way, is what I've found. And so I think that I kind of have put my eggs in that basket of, it's stream of conscious, but it's also stream of conscious with the intent of making a song. And so then I start to kind of rely on my own knowledge of song. And to be clear too, I think it's interesting to talk about, because if you were saying, okay, I'm going to improvise with the intent of creating, you know, I'm going to improvise in the format of song, essentially. It means like, well, what song tradition are you relying on? You know, if I was an Irish folk musician, it would have like a bunch of verses and refrains. If I was, you know, a blues musician, it might have verses and some instrumental tags in there with their refrains. If I'm relying on kind of the jazz standard or like the American songbook format, it would be an AABA kind of situation. And I think I'm probably leaning into popular song, you know, like over the last probably 75 years in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's kind of a cool thing, because when you say to someone, okay, go ahead, improvise in the format of song, is like, it's kind of cool because everybody has a different version of what that is, you know? And the song traditions are different. It's not all just, you know, for everyone, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge, chorus. It's not everything like a top 40 song, you know? So I found a lot of solace in that kind of process, certainly.
So when you say improvising, are you improvising guitar and lyrics and melody and chords,
Yeah.
like everything, the whole shoot and match?
Yeah, totally. And I
And
think,
do you find often that keeper lyrics comes out of the air in that way for you?
oh yeah,
Wow,
totally.
that's awesome.
Yeah, totally. And I think that with that comes this really big, for me, a realization that in order to do it, you have to let the margins be incredibly wide and really allow yourself to do it. If you're, so I think making anything, and honestly just being alive and being a human, you have this intense, these voices that show up in the attempt to do anything that are going to try and like shut it down.
Yep.
You try and write a song, you hear these really loud voices that say like, this is terrible, you've never written a worse song, why do you even try?
I know those voices.
Yeah, we all do, we're all acquainted. But it became, the 15-minute thing for me started to become like almost an exercise in endurance and in some way stamina, to think I can play music and I'm allowed to just make things up. And the only thing that's really stopping me is just my mind, in saying like, stop, you sound horrible. Stop. This is embarrassing for you, But if I'm able to acknowledge like, oh, I hear that voice saying that, and then just keep going, then I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
We all
it's only
can.
15 minutes.
Yeah, it's not that long.
Okay, so tell me about the EP then. Obviously, like I haven't heard it, but it may be out and available by the time this podcast is out. Yeah. So, is it just a solo acoustic thing, like this tour you're talking about?
Yeah,
okay.
It is a solo acoustic thing, which I've never done before. It's called The Sun Doesn't Think, and it is a group of 5 songs that I wrote very recently, and it was really kind of a beautiful thing to just go into the studio by myself and make some music happen. So, The Sun Doesn't Think. It was also really interesting to make music. Like I said before, I usually like cover my own songs, but this was kind of the process of just not covering them,
So they're kind of stripped down arrangement wise or guitar wise or whatever, is it?
Yeah, I arrange everything kind of similarly, no matter the instrumentation. I think if it's going to go on record, I kind of put my arranging brain on, but in terms of, the instrumentation, to just play something on acoustic guitar, it's just not something I usually is my first idea. And this one just felt like I kind of needed it on some level to just play some music and let it be a simple setup for sure. So
cool. Did you record it live?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
It's all just me in a room playing some songs.
So do you have some sort of setup at home to do that, or do you have a studio that you work at usually, or what's your preference there?
I did this with a friend. His name is Mark Goodell, incredible engineer that is in Brooklyn. And he works with my husband, Julian, and he engineered Devotion also for me. Okay. And then I produced records of Julian's and he was working on them. So we've worked a bunch together.
Okay.
And he was the first kind of person on my mind to make this EP happen, because I knew he had a cool setup and that I knew him, and I could just go kind of sneak in and do it. That was the setup for this one.
And like, were you even wearing headphones or anything, or you're just playing totally acoustically in a room and that was that?
Just totally acoustically in a room. Yeah.
No overdubs or anything like that.
There's like a couple harmonies, I think, on a couple of songs. And then one of them, I think I overdub a little bit of electric guitar, but other than that stuff, some of that stuff I had to wear some headphones for, but all the performances were all just, just in the room.
Did you do it in just like one session, the whole thing?
We did it in 2 days. I originally tracked 6 or 7 songs, then I kept 5 of them. So we did it in two chunks for sure. And then yeah, it was just a quick one. Got it mixed in the matter of a few days after that, mastered the next day, and now it's
coming out.
Now
Awesome.
it's here.
Yeah. So do you live in Brooklyn? Or are you in Manhattan, or what part of
We're
of
in
the city are you
Jersey
in?
now. We actually moved to Jersey.
Okay.
We lived in New York for forever, like 11, 12 years. And then we now live about 35 minutes outside of Manhattan. Yeah, I mean, it's weird for us because we felt like New Jersey was like a different country or something in our minds. And now it feels like it's going to a different borough. It's actually very close where we live, which is great.
Yeah, but still, like it is different. Like it's definitely like a divide there, you know?
Yeah, we don't live in the city anymore. It is a different thing, but it served us so well.
I know Julian's been, you know, deeply into the New York jazz scene in the city for a long time. Have you been like, do you find for you as a songwriter that you were very like invested in the music scene in New York City, either in Manhattan or Brooklyn or wherever you were living, in that same kind of way that he was?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's my whole world for sure. That now I'm a little bit. In some ways, I think I kind of keep to myself. I write mostly alone. I don't really co-write a whole lot, and but at the same time, I went to Berklee College of Music when I was,
Me too.
Just 18. Oh, cool. Awesome. That's so great. I started when I'm 35 now. I started when I just turned 18. And then the time I was 21, I moved to New York, and all of my friends did the same thing. You know, everybody moved to New York. So I came up in New York with a lot of my friends and my peers, and everybody was, just like hustling and doing their thing and making it happen. So I totally am a product of the New York City music scene for sure.
Can you tell me a bit about that? Like, so this would be like early 2000s, I guess, or
2010 is when I moved to New York City.
Okay. And so what did that take for you? Like, did you have to work jobs and stuff to like get by in New York? Cause it's like such a crazy place to live. Like what was that like as a, before you had records out, before you were really like touring successfully? What was your, what did it take to get by in New York for you as a songwriter?
Yeah. I moved to New York, I think in 2010. And then from there, I started to, I was a babysitter. I babysat that was my first kind of side gig.
Yeah.
And I was doing, I was 21 when I moved to New York. So I was 21, I was babysitting, and then I was just really playing anywhere that would have me at all times. So I would play like, gosh, I was playing in, at the time the living room was open. That was in the East Lower East Side.
Yeah.
So I would get, maybe a residency in the living room, usually on like the worst night that you could get. It would be like on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I would also have a residency at Rockwood Music Hall. I would have a residency at Pete's Candy Store. And I would just take these gigs and that nobody wanted, and then just, show up, write for them, just try my hardest to be as many places as I possibly could. Mm-hmm. I think the New York scene has evolved a little bit, where when I was young in that era, there was a lot of music and a lot of venues that were happening at that time. And you could be downtown in Manhattan and run into all of your friends and pop into somebody's gig and then find out there was another gig down the street. If you were in the Lower East Side, there was all the venues were happening. And now I think it's a little different. I think the scene is a tiny bit more muted, especially post-COVID. It took a toll on
the venues, especially, probably.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, Manhattan specifically, like all of those venues took a real hard hit. But I think in Brooklyn right now, there's still, there's a scene in Brooklyn that I find to be a little more kind kind of current and in real time musicians are actually working in these venues and having like some communal energy. But then once, maybe a couple of years in, or maybe I'm 23, I got a gig with nannying for a family. And so I took care of 4 kids in Brooklyn with a family that they're still my dearest friends and super sweet. And we still get together and say hello all the time. But that was probably from 22, maybe to 26. I did all of these residencies, like really hardcore, constantly, maybe for 3 or 4 months at a time. And then I was a nanny. And that was like my double life, constantly going between these two worlds.
But that allowed you to do it. That allowed you to.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. It was such a blessing. And I would bring all my gear to my nannying gig, schlepping all my amp and everything and all my stuff, gig bags and the whole deal. Yeah. And then I would go from there, because I lived in deeper Brooklyn, and then I would come to their house. And then from there, they were closer to Manhattan. And then I would go to Manhattan from there. And then I would work my way back and go back at night and then just start over every day. So it was kind of a perfect setup and a perfect gig for a young person that was doing the thing in New York. It really worked for me in that way.
Were you always living in Brooklyn at that time, or were you in Manhattan for part of the time too?
I lived in Brooklyn for a good amount of time. I was there for about 5 years. Initially. And then I started out in Harlem, and then that was only for about, 6 to 12 months or something like that. And then I went down to Brooklyn. I was there for 5 or 6 years. Then I moved up to the Upper West Side. And I was, on 75th and Central Park for a little while. And it just so happened that Julian, my now husband, lived at 69th and Central Park. Okay. And we started dating closely after I had moved up there, totally unplanned that I was going to be living up there anyway. And so then we lived in this little sweet bubble of the Upper West Side. Yeah. And he was on 69th Street, I was on 75th, and we'd meet at 72nd and, go to dinner or whatever. Eventually I moved in with him at 69th Street. And then after that, we lived in Fort Greene for a while. We moved back down to Brooklyn. We've I have lived all over New York City, certainly. And Julian mostly lived on the Upper West Side. And then in Brooklyn for a little while, we lived together after that. So most of my time was spent in Brooklyn, but I had a few years in Manhattan also.
Were you sort of crossing over into the jazz scene with what you were doing? Is that where you guys met, or was he sort of crossing into the singer-songwriter scene?
We met at Berklee.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and we had some crossover of friends actually in the kind of acoustic music scene, because I was a fiddle player when I was really young. That was my first instrument.
Oh, okay.
And there was this whole scene at Berklee that was this kind of acoustic music scene. Yeah. And Julian had mutual friends there, and he had, when he was young, Dave Grisman was kind of a mentor to him. And so he had a lot of friends in that scene also. And so then we kind of had this mutual friend group, and we met when we were very young there.
Okay.
And then, and I think, sometimes Julian jokes that I'm the jazz musician and he's like the singer-songwriter or something like that, because he writes such cool melodic tunes. And then I can get kind of weird, but I feel like the jazz scene for me, I've never, I'm not a jazz musician by any stretch of the imagination, but I have learned so much in being in New York, because it is, the jazz capital of America.
Yeah.
And being surrounded by such high level musicians all the time, with the intent of, bringing really pure, intense energy into the music that's being made. It's totally shaped who I am in so many ways.
It seems that way to me, that you've been inspired and drawn things from it without necessarily, I don't know if you ever played much jazz at all.
Part of my life, it's just that's part of the fabric of my upbringing. I was raised in a house that appreciated jazz really intensely. And I'm married to a jazz musician. I've also had the kind of the honor in many ways of Julian has worked with John Zorn for such a long time, and I've been around that sphere for such a long time.
That's a pretty cool sphere.
Yeah, it's an amazing sphere, and all those musicians are, friends of mine, and just really lead with really interesting choices,
Yeah.
And with the intent of making music that does kind of cross boundaries and, bend our assumptions about things. So I think I've gleaned that much from those musicians and more, for sure.
Do you have a background of playing jazz guitar at all?
No. When I was young, in like the 5th grade, I was a really young person and I was playing the fiddle, and I was, going to Weiser, Idaho to play in the old time fiddle championship and things like that. So
you were hardcore into that whole thing.
Yeah, totally. I was,
okay.
That was kind of like my music school as a young person, was being around this really intense, cool acoustic music scene. So because I was like a Texas style, quote, Texas style fiddler, the accompaniment for that music is full of passing chords. Yep. So it has this real, it's almost like, it almost has like a Django kind of thing without the kind of gypsy part of it. Like that kind of the feeling of like that many passing chords in succession constantly was really what I started to become used to as a young person. And that was what the guitar player would do for the fiddle player. And that's like what was expected. You'd never strum like an open G chord.
Right.
It was all really tightly led chords in sequence up and down the neck. Boom, down, 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 like that.
Yep.
A very micro little example of maybe the musicality that would go into it. But then I would start to learn those, sequences on the guitar. So that was a part of my education in some ways, was just learning how to lead, chords and kind of starting to explore the neck beyond like the first few frets of the guitar.
Were you aware, like theory-wise, what was happening?
Not really. It was all in my ears, and I understood, but theory, like, not really. I didn't really understand what was going on. And now I think what I gleaned from it in so many ways was, especially after going from music school, it felt like I was around so many intense theory heads that I didn't really need to also be one,
Yeah.
I didn't need to. It was okay.
They had it covered. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think whenever I'm curious, I go explore, but I don't, I'm not really like living in that territory all the time. I'm not drawing. I mean, I'm not writing charts or anything for my songs. It's like, it's all in my ears, but, and I also have a healthy understanding, of the building blocks of what's going on.
Cool. Can we just talk about Echo the Diamond now? I love that record since I first heard it, and it's just got such a unique sound. Like, it's so immediate and kind of heavy and sparse at the same time. And I would just love to hear a little bit about the process, because like I can't really tell if it was a really live kind of session or if it was like very much not that. It kind of reminds me almost of like there's a couple of Chris Whitley records that came out in the early 2000s. I don't know if you ever heard those, but
I don't know.
Really? Okay. Well, he made so do you know who he is?
No, I don't think so.
Really? You should check him out. So he was a songwriter. He died maybe 10, 15 years ago. I knew him a little bit, but he was like a very edgy, interesting guitar player and wrote amazing songs, and he sang great. But he had this huge hit with his first record, and then all his records after that kind of got weird and sort of like he got more improvisational and stuff. And some of the tonalities of what he does, what you do reminds me of him in that era cool. Yeah. There's a record of his called Din of Ecstasy that has sort of a
Cool name.
yeah. It's almost like a Ornette Coleman approach to being a singer-songwriter in some way.
Rad.
Yeah. Anyway, could you tell me a little bit about how you made the record and like conceptually how it sounds the way it does?
Oh gosh. Sure. I made that record. I wrote a lot of the songs on acoustic guitar, and then once I probably pulled from like 30-ish songs or so, and then I
wow. Okay.
distilled down to the ones that, you hear now. And then I knew I wanted to play trio, and I liked that format a lot. I knew it was going to be a pretty plugged in record. And
were you playing live with Dave King and Chris Morrissey at that point, or were they just guys that you knew?
So I had played with Chris for a very long time. He was part of the touring band for Emotions and Math.
Okay.
And so we had logged a lot of hours on tour and in every setting you could think of. And he is on Emotions and Math as well.
Okay.
And so I knew that Chris really has he's an incredible bass player, but he has a really cool understanding for, I would say, kind of like alternative rock, to be honest. He's a wealth of knowledge for kind of like this 90s era rock and roll. And I feel like the way that he plays the bass is he's largely known as a jazz bass player in many ways, but his electric playing, he's played for so many different singers and songwriters. Mm-hmm. And his electric playing, I think he's in his kind of heart and mind, there is like a lot of Pearl Jam in him. Yeah. And so I always really loved that we kind of shared that love of that music. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some element that he and I were kind of, communicating without words, in both being lovers of that kind of era of music. So then I was kind of realizing, okay, I need a band. So I'm going to I think Chris would be great. And then I'd always wanted to make music with Dave King. Mm-hmm. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity. And
Did you just know him from New York?
I had been introduced to him by Julian. Julian and him had been playing together, made records together. And he's like, a very, very close friend of ours. So he's, he comes and hangs at the house and stuff all the time. But I knew that he and I were going to make music at some point. And so I felt like I think this is the opportunity to do that. So I had them over at the house, and we played the songs together. And that was really the kind of like, let's cover these songs. And I don't quite know what they're going to be yet, but let's figure it out. And and really all that music kind of came to life and was born in many ways. I kind of had an idea of what the kind of direction I wanted. I wanted it to be really, I wanted it to rely on the musicianship in a lot of ways. Like, you couldn't have like a better setup, like Chris Morrissey and Dave King. They're such incredible musicians. So it's not like you need a lot of rehearsal. You just need to know, you just need to be like a good director, And so like, I think of sometimes being in the studio in that way. It's probably how I'll always make records from here on out, but it's more like taking a photograph than it is like sculpting, That's
pretty big picture concept though, like being able to look at what you're doing in that way when you're probably also really just trying to focus on like, singing in tune and playing cool guitar parts and all that stuff too, right? Like that's a lot to kind of think in the microscopic and macroscopic way of recording.
Well, I think that for me, a lot of what I would do was like leading up to a record, especially this one, I would do things like I would play in my living room and Julian would have the phone or an iPad or whatever, some kind of camera, and capture me playing my songs. And then I would look at it and ask the question, like, what do you think of this singer-songwriter? Like, what's your critique?
Right.
And then I would a long list would form. And it was truly like with love, what you would say to somebody that was like, a person coming up in the world that wanted to do it for a living and whatever. And I would start to say like, well, I might fire the guitar player on this one, Meanwhile, I was the guitar player, obviously. I was the guitar player and the singer, and I'm just playing solo. But it would be that kind of sentiment, or it would be like, well, it's a cool, I can tell that she knows how to do this, but I'm a little bored, in this one. Or this one, it feels like you kind of lose me for the second half. And then I would go back to these songs and keep on figuring them and keep figuring them. By the time I'm showing up to the guys and saying like, okay, I want to make a record, I've kind of done a lot of the homework, knowing that I'd like to take a snapshot of these songs and just have the live performances kind of be what the record is. It means that you just have to go to the studio with whatever you have and know that that's enough. So you just want to like make sure what you have is something worth taking a photograph of,
Did they know the songs when you guys started, or were they being introduced to the songs in the studio?
No, they knew them. We'd played through them in my basement,
Okay.
a couple of times, like once or twice. Yeah. But that's also kind of like I've found a really good tactic is like everybody knows of the songs and they know them kind of, but they're not like, we haven't played them through 20 times and we haven't been on tour with them, nothing. It's all very fresh in everyone's hands. And so again, it's like this little tightrope kind of situation where everyone's trying to get it and nail it, but they don't quite know it fully, but they do. I don't know. It's a cool little place to be in because everyone's trying to shine. It's not like assumed that everybody just knows how to do it. And, well, I kind of dragged on this part. It's not like that kind of mentality. It's more like, is it interesting or is it not interesting?
Yeah. So would you record a lot of versions of stuff, or would you pretty much just like do a couple takes and move on to another song?
It depends. Like some things, for whatever reason, they didn't, again, if not everybody, including myself, like is completely up to speed on how everyone's feeling the tune or et cetera, then maybe we'd get like 4 takes in and the 5th one would be it. But then for the most part, there was a lot of first take, second take kind of energy. Yeah. Like that song Female Brain that's on that record. That was song. The rehearsal of the song was what you hear now.
Really?
For that one. Yeah. And then there were a few others that were first takes. And then I went in and recorded vocals separately because I thought like, surely I can't just keep the vocals that I did, for these super live takes. And then I retracked all of it. And then I didn't use any of the retrack. Really? Because it was all whack. Yeah.
I wondered about that because it's so dialed into the guitar stuff that you're doing. It seemed impossible to me that you would have overdubbed that. So I guess that is the case that you you tried and it was just cooler with the live stuff.
I find that the swagger in terms of the guitar playing and the singing, they got to happen together. And that if I'm like trying to then take this, guitar that I was playing live with the band and then sing on top of it, overdub the lead vocal, it's going to be whack. It's going to sound like I'm trying a little too hard, or I've drank a little too much water. I've gotten too much sleep. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's an edgy quality that is there that happens between the guitar and the voice that I don't think I can't imagine you being able to make it cooler than just doing it how it goes down.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
Were there some where that was a problem? Like, did you blow a line or did you sing a pitchy thing that you were unhappy with at some point that became an issue, or were you able to fix some of those things, or did you just live with them?
There were times that I tried. I would try to either tune something because I thought everything else is great.
Mm-hmm.
We just tune this little thing, and then once we did, it would be kind of whack again. Like it was always. I kept trying to see, like, surely I can't just, and then no, you can, And also, there's something about, I think, there's something to be learned, I think, for myself in that moment to understand that, like the ego section of it getting in the way is not really how the listener benefits. Like me kind of being a little flat for a word or whatever, to change it and kind of make it more, quote, perfect or, more in tune. It didn't really help it. It really didn't. It didn't
never does.
Somehow. Yeah. It didn't really somehow, I remember actually my friend, and just the best guitar player, in the world, Nels Cline, was saying, like, rock and roll's not supposed to be in tune. It's not, it's just not supposed to be like that, And I always kind of was like, I don't know if I believe him, is it really true, or is it just something to say? And I feel like in this record, I really learned a lot from that even rhythm feels better when things feel just slightly strained or slightly pitchy, or like everything is grooving in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
That I think is actually like a credit to intonation at times. Like if I had hit it literally like on the money, perfectly in tune, I don't think that, like certain things would communicate as well. It really, that one really was. And of course, in the mixing process for that record, I was really thankful for it, because when you do capture something so raw and live, I think for records that I make often, you can capture it really quickly. And then in mixing, you can kind of like stew it and, cook it and take your time with making it so that you can get it just so, because you're working with pretty raw materials. And so I kind of enjoy the mixing process to kind of massage it in a way, and take your time and understanding, like, if we have something so live, like what is the priority and what's the leader in the mixing process? It's interesting.
Yeah, there's like a song like Get Back has some interesting vocal effects on it, like some echoey kind of things that happen sort of out of the blue. Were those things that you kind of had premeditated, or was that like that was totally Brett.
That was Brett Bullion, the guy who mixed it. He had a cool vision with some of these things and then once I heard some of the things he was doing, it kind of started. At first, I was really turned around of like, because I was so used to hearing this kind of really raw information. But then once he started to send that stuff to me, I started to understand, like, oh, interesting. Like we could.
It's really effective.
Yeah, juice it a little bit more, and send it a little bit more, so that even though it's all so live, you can kind of still have an experience, like a record experience.
Yeah,
more for sure.
It seems very dry. Like I don't think there's very much effects on, the vocals or anything like that. Yeah, for the most part. And then, so when they do happen, it's like, oh wow, there's like this whole thing going on.
Yeah,
it's super cool.
Right. Totally.
There's you double some vocals though, right? Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, there's double vocals. I'm not really a big one for harmony, but there's a little bit of harmony in there. Maybe, can't remember.
Is the doubling something that you like artistically feel drawn? Like I know Elliott Smith, you're a big fan of him, and basically
that was all Elliott for me.
Okay,
that DNA kind of lives in my heart and mind. Something to kind of do and use as a device.
That's probably a good way to like kind of fix something that might be bugging you too. Is like double that shit up, and like, maybe it goes away too, right? Was that ever the reason for doubling like that for John Lennon? I know he hated his voice, and so that's why he doubled every single Beatles performance is doubled vocal, because he hated his voice. That's so interesting.
I don't think I've ever used it as like a device to cover up, but I think I often use it just like an arrangement strategy. And then,
do you have those things in mind going in, or do you add them?
I usually have doubled stuff. Like I hear it usually when I'm writing it. I'm like, this will probably be doubled. That's just kind of, I think, a part of my own vocabulary at this point is that I like to double certain things.
And that's from Elliott Smith that you got into that.
I cleaned a lot of that. Like that became kind of part of my, kind of my writing DNA and record.
There's some like signature chord progressions of yours that happen that kind of like are reminiscent of him too. Is he like one of your prime songwriting influences, would you say?
Yeah, he's totally in there. He's a big one for me. I think his kind of contrapuntal stuff and the way that he moves on the guitar has always been like a really big inspiration, and it was always made me feel really satisfied as a listener listening to his songs. So yes, he's a big leader for me.
You also hit some like really gnarly seventh chords that remind me of like, that's what he did too a lot. It's just like hit these like really kind of like strong, like dominant seventh chords.
Totally.
And they're like a thing in your songwriting too.
Totally.
What about some of the guitar-y things where you double those up? Like there's, I think on Get Back actually too, there's like acoustic guitar that's like doubling the riff kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. Also, Elliott kind of, inspired. I mean, before I made Emotions and Math, I was probably in the biggest Elliott phase of my life. I listened to all of his records back to front, and then I would start over at the beginning and listen to them all over again. So I was really steeped in that music for a long time, and I listen to it a little less now, but I think it kind of never leaves for whatever reason. It's just kind of that one stuck with me pretty hard. So, his DNA, but then, the Beatles, I think, are certainly in there too, with those kind of maybe more dominant chords at times. There's so many different kind of influences, but Elliott is, he's someone that really had an impression on me.
What about like blues or country players? Like sometimes it seems like maybe some of that kind of stuff is seeped into your music somehow, but were you ever listening to that kind of music in any big way?
I mean, I was raised on, there was certainly like blues in the house, whether I was like really aware of it or not as a young person. And then I was a fiddle player, so I was around a lot of folk music as a young person. So I feel like, there was a lot of, for me, country almost, it didn't make it in as much really because I was in the more niche acoustic world. It wasn't like Three Chords and the Truth kind of vibe. It was more like, like Celtic fiddle music and Irish fiddle music and, old time like Appalachian music. And it was like a little bit more close to picture, I would say, and less like popular music. And so I feel like I got a lot of inspiration from a lot of different places, but to pinpoint like a certain country artist, like Dolly Parton is probably, she's definitely in there. Lucinda Williams is definitely in there. But I don't think there were like older sources that felt like I was, like an older kind of country head or anything like that. It was just kind of, I had this big swath of kind of just musical experience that was kind of the folky world.
Yeah. What about the guitar sounds on that record? Like Act Natural, I think just is one of the coolest sounding guitar things I've heard in a long time. What were you using for that session, and like how did you capture that crazy guitar sound?
Oh gosh, I was playing through I think I was playing my deluxe. So I had a Tele Deluxe for that session, and I mostly played the deluxe, and then for a couple things I played a Danica.
Sorry, what is a Tele Deluxe? What is that, a humbucker Tele?
Yes, double humbucker. Okay. So both humbuckers, and then It's like mine is 78. So it's like a CBS era telly vibe. 3-bolt neck. So it's like kind of bendy. And, a lot of people I think don't aspire to have them in some ways. And then now I think they're kind of finding their way. Like I see them around a lot more these days. But yeah, that's the guitar I use. And then I would say like if there was like kind of a secret weapon, it won't be secret anymore, but I use a Cornish unit, a Pete Cornish pedal.
What is it?
It's like I kind of use it like a preamp in a way.
Okay.
It is acting as a compressor, which I keep at 0. I just turn it on and keep it at the lowest possible setting. And so it kind of blooms a little bit more, but it doesn't feel like actually super compressed. And then I also use, on that, I'm using the drive on it. So I'm kind of playing the gain against the volume and using that as an overdrive. But basically I use that at all times now since I got it. We actually got that as a wedding gift, which is very sweet, Julian.
Nice. You made a very large gesture with your hands when you described that. Is it a huge unit or is it just a pedal?
It's about this big. It's not small. It's like, it's about 10 inches wide.
And it sits on your amp or something?
No, I put it on a pedal board, but I use a tiny tuner and then a Flint like Strymon reverb and the Cornish, and that's it. So it's really like I only use 3 pedals and one of them is a tuning pedal, but that one takes up the majority. And it's kind of like 2 pedals in one in a way. So it's like a unit,
And is that where the overdrive is coming from? Is from that unit, or are you turning your amp up really loud, or how are you getting that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, but usually I always test with an amp. Like, do I want to use the unit? Does it sound fine? Just overdriven?
The unit.
Yeah, the unit. Do I want to actually use it, or is the amp just fine on its own? Because for a long time I would just use the amp on its own. I didn't really use a lot of overdrive. But now I see that it just kind of places it puts it in a place that sounds a little more produced, I would say. Like there's a record quality to the Cornish pedal thing that is really special. So I feel lucky to own that piece of equipment. And I find it to be like soulful. It doesn't feel like a piece of gear at this point. It's kind of like, feels like part of the amp in some ways.
Is it rare? I've never heard of this thing.
That one, the thing that I have is kind of rare. It's like a custom thing, but it's really kind of a merging of 2 pedals that he already makes.
Okay.
So I think it's the CC one and the OC one, I think is what they're called. And mine just has both in one unit essentially. So mine, you can't buy it, off of like a website. I'm sure you could just order it from him custom, but yes, it is something that is merging 2 things together.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, it's been great talking to you about all this stuff. And
yes, totally. It's so fun.
Very fascinating. And thanks for doing it.
Yes.
And so the new EP is called?
It's called The Sun Doesn't Think.
The Sun Doesn't Think. It's coming out in May?
April 26th. So
April 26th.
I think it will have already seen the light of day. Probably. Okay.
And will you be on tour a bunch for the rest of the year as well?
We're doing the tour in May. That's from May 2nd to May 10th. So I think that will already be done as well. And then we'll be doing some festivals in the summer, which would be great. And then Japan in June, which will be cool. Yeah, it'll be fun. Although I'm not sure that the Japan thing will be announced when this comes out. So I don't know whether to include that or not.
Okay.
I don't know when that's actually going to be public, but I think it's going to be public very soon because it's in June. So,
all right. Well, thanks so much. And
yes, totally. Thank you for having me. I'm glad we could all make it work.
Yeah, me too. I hope to see you around Nashville one of these days.
Yes, totally. Thanks so much, Steve. See you next time.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Margaret. Bye.
Bye.
Music Makers and Soul Shakers is a bi-weekly podcast produced at the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You can also find us at makersandShakerspodcast.com. Thanks again to our sponsors this season, Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Henhouse Hang. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.